I almost didn't notice it. That's the part that still haunts me. We were standing at the check-in counter at Pearson, my son-in-law and I, and he was being so helpful, grabbing my bag, checking the tags, handing my passport to the agent before I even reached for it. I remember thinking, this is nice. My daughter had always said he was thoughtful. I believed her. That was a Tuesday morning in late October. The kind of cold that sneaks up on you. Not brutal yet. Just enough to remind you that winter is coming. I was wearing the navy blazer my wife Helen had given me for our 40th anniversary. She passed 3 years ago. Breast cancer. I wear that blazer whenever I travel because it feels like she's still with me somehow. Silly, maybe, but grief makes you do things like that. The trip was my idea, or at least I thought it was. About 6 weeks earlier, my son-in-law, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's what he is, even now, even after everything, he had come to me with this plan. A father and son type trip, he said. Well, father-in-law and son-in-law, but same idea. He wanted us to go to Portugal together. Lisbon, then Porto. He said he'd always wanted to go, that he thought it would be meaningful, just the two of us. My daughter couldn't get time off work. The grandkids were in school. It was just going to be us. I was touched. Genuinely. I'm 67 years old, and my son-in-law had never once suggested we do anything alone together. We got along fine. Dinners at Thanksgiving, helping him fix the deck one summer, that kind of thing. But we weren't close in the way I'd always hoped. When he proposed the trip, I thought maybe we were finally getting there. We booked 10 days. Business class, which surprised me because he'd always been careful with money. When I offered to split the cost, he waved me off. Said it was his treat. Said I deserved it. I should have asked more questions. But I was 67 and lonely, and I wanted to believe my son-in-law loved me. We got through security without any trouble. My son-in-law had printed everything. Boarding passes, hotel confirmations, even a little itinerary with restaurants he'd researched. I remember looking at it and thinking, he really put effort into this. We grabbed coffee at a Tim Hortons near the gate. He got me a large double-double, exactly how I take it. He knew that. He'd known that for 12 years. We sat and talked about the trip. He was excited, or he seemed excited. He was telling me about this restaurant in Alfama, the old quarter of Lisbon, where they do traditional fado music while you eat. He said Helen would have loved it. That stopped me. I looked at him. He looked back with this soft expression, this careful tenderness. She always talked about Portugal, he said. I remember her saying she wanted to go someday. I didn't know Helen had said that. The fact that he remembered it, that he'd built a whole trip around it, undid me a little. I had to look away at the departures board so he wouldn't see my eyes get wet. We boarded maybe 40 minutes later. The flight to Lisbon from Toronto is about 7 hours. We settled into our seats, and he insisted I take the window. He ordered us each a glass of red wine before takeoff. He said it was tradition for international flights, that his father used to do it. And I laughed and said, all right, 1 glass won't hurt. But just before they brought the wine, my son-in-law stood up. He said he needed to use the washroom before the seatbelt sign came on. He took his phone with him. That wasn't strange. People do that. I didn't watch him go. I was looking out the window at the tarmac, at the ground crew in their orange vests, at the gray October sky. I was thinking about Helen. I was thinking about how she would have loved this. The business class seats, the wine, the idea of wandering the cobbled streets of Lisbon together. My son-in-law came back. He sat down. He seemed, I don't know the word exactly, settled, like something had been decided. The wine came. We toasted, he said. To new memories, I said. To Helen. I was about to take the first sip when someone touched my shoulder from behind. I turned around and there was a man in a plain gray jacket standing in the aisle. Not a flight attendant. He wasn't in uniform. He leaned down and said very quietly, very close to my ear, "Sir, I need you to come with me. Act like nothing is wrong." I almost laughed. I genuinely thought it was some kind of mistake. I said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "My name is Officer Beaulieu. I'm with the CBSA." I need you to stand up slowly and follow me off the aircraft. Do not make a scene. Your son-in-law cannot know you're leaving. The Canada Border Services Agency. I knew what that was. My brother-in-law had worked customs at the Vancouver airport for 20 years. I looked at my son-in-law. He was looking at his phone, scrolling, casual, unbothered. I stood up. I said, "Excuse me a moment," to no one in particular, and I followed Officer Bolio back up the aisle toward the front of the plane. My legs felt strange. The wine glass was still in my hand. I set it down on a tray as we passed. They took me into the jet bridge, that covered walkway between the gate and the plane, and there were two other people waiting. A woman in a CBSA jacket, a man in plainclothes who identified himself as Detective something RCMP. He said fast, and I didn't catch the last name. The woman was holding a small sealed evidence bag. Inside the bag was a bottle, a plastic water bottle, the kind you refill. It was mine. I recognized it because Helen had given it to me, this brushed steel blue color with a small engraved maple leaf near the base. She'd bought it at a market in Kensington. I stared at it. "Detective," I'll call him the detective, said, "Mr. Crawford, do you recognize this bottle?" I said yes. I said it was mine. I said I'd had it in my carry-on. He said, "We need you to know that this bottle was flagged by our detection system as we were doing a final sweep of the aircraft before departure. We tested its contents." He paused. "Just for a second. It doesn't contain water." I don't know how long I stood there without saying anything. It felt like a long time. The jet bridge hummed around us. Through the small oval windows I could see the tarmac, still gray, the same ground crew still moving around below. "What does it contain?" I asked. The woman with the evidence bag said something technical, the name of a compound I'd never heard before. Then she said, more plainly, "It's a sedative, a significant dose. Combined with alcohol, it would have caused serious cardiac and respiratory depression within 2 to 3 hours of ingestion, especially in a person your age, with your medical history." My medical history. I have mild arrhythmia. I take a blood thinner. Both of those things are on file with my doctor and, apparently, with someone else who had looked into them. Who? I started. I stopped. I already knew. Of course I already knew. But my brain was refusing to put the words together. Detective said, "We've been monitoring your son-in-law's communications for the past 3 weeks. We received a tip from a financial crimes unit in Ontario. The tip was about estate fraud. Not about this, but when we started looking at his activity, we found some other things. He'd been researching compounds. He'd been communicating with someone. We obtained a warrant yesterday. 3 weeks. They'd been watching him for 3 weeks and no one had told me. I understood why. They needed me to behave normally, needed him not to suspect anything. But standing in that jet bridge, I felt something that I can only describe as the floor dropping out from under a life I thought I knew. My daughter. "What did my daughter know?" I asked. I asked right there, out loud, maybe more loudly than I should have. The detective shook his head. "Nothing. As far as we can determine, she's not a suspect. We'll be speaking with her this morning." My daughter was at work right now, at her office in Mississauga, answering emails probably, doing whatever lawyers do on Tuesday mornings. She had no idea her husband was sitting on a plane 40 feet away with a bottle of poison he'd put in her father's bag. I had to sit down. There was a bench along the jet bridge wall, one of those fold-sound seats, and I just sat there for a minute with my hands on my knees. Officer Beaulieu crouched down to my level. He had a kind face, I remember that. Maybe mid-40s, French-Canadian accent. He said, "We're going to ask you to do something difficult. We'd like you to go back to your seat." I looked at him. "We need him to get off that plane in Lisbon. We have arrangements with Portuguese authorities, but our jurisdiction gets complicated if he's removed here. If you go back in there, sit down, behave normally, and take the flight. We'll have a plainclothes officer seated 3 rows behind you the entire flight. You will not drink anything except sealed cans that you open yourself. You'll be safe. And when you land, we'll have everything we need." I said, You want me to sit next to him for 7 hours? Yes, sir. Knowing what he put in my bottle? Yes, sir. I looked at the evidence bag, at my bottle, at the little maple leaf Helen had liked because she said it was proudly Canadian. I thought about my daughter. I thought about my grandchildren, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, 7 and 9. They called me Papa. Every Sunday I drove to their house in Burlington and we made pancakes together, and they argued about the toppings. Real maple syrup only. I always insisted, and they groaned every time and then ate it, and admitted it was better. I thought about what would have happened over the Atlantic if I'd taken a sip of that wine and then had a glass of water from my bottle somewhere over Greenland. My son-in-law would have raised the alarm when I stopped breathing. The flight would have diverted maybe, or maybe not in time. It would have looked like a cardiac event. My arrhythmia was a matter of record. It would have looked exactly like something that had been a long time coming, and he would have landed in Lisbon, flown home, and gone through my estate. My estate, my house in Oakville, paid off, worth just under $1.2 million now with the market, my RRSP, my pension from 34 years with the provincial government, Helen's life insurance, everything I had, everything we had built. He had researched it. He had done the math. He had decided I was worth more to him dead than alive. I stood up from the bench. I said, "All right, 7 hours. I can do 7 hours." They briefed me on what not to do. Don't act differently. Don't avoid eye contact. Don't refuse food or drink in a way that seems unusual. Accept offers graciously. Just don't consume anything he's handled. They gave me a small earpiece option that I declined because I knew I'd be too aware of it. I said I just needed to get back in there before he noticed the wine going warm. Officer Beaulieu walked me to the door of the aircraft. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. He said, "You're going to be okay, Mr. Crawford." I nodded. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I walked back in. My son-in-law looked up as I came down the aisle. He said, "Everything all right?" I said, "Line for the washroom." I sat down. I picked up my wine glass. I pretended to take a sip without letting any of it past my lips. 7 hours. I have never been a poker player. Helen used to say I was the worst liar she'd ever known. She meant it fondly, I think, or mostly fondly. But she also said I was stubborn enough to do hard things when I had. She was right about that, at least. I talked to him. I talked to him for 7 hours. We talked about the trip, about the Hieronymus Monastery, about taking the tram up to the castle, about the pastéis de nata from the famous bakery near Belém. We talked about the grandchildren. We talked about hockey. He was a Leafs fan, which I'd always held against him in a joking way, and we argued about it again like we always did. I made myself laugh at his jokes. I made myself ask follow-up questions. At one point, somewhere over the Atlantic, he fell asleep, and I sat in the dark with the hum of the engines, and I looked at his face. He looked so ordinary. That's what I couldn't reconcile. He looked like my son-in-law. He looked like the man who'd come to my house every Christmas for 12 years, who'd held my hand at Helen's funeral, who'd cried. He had cried real tears. I'd seen them, at her graveside. Or maybe those were real. Maybe some of it was real. I don't know. I've stopped trying to know. We landed in Lisbon just after 7 in the morning local time. The light was soft and golden the way it is in southern Europe in autumn. Even through everything, I noticed that. Helen would have gasped at it. We got off the plane. We walked through the jet bridge into the terminal. My son-in-law was talking about finding coffee, about exchanging some currency, about whether we should take the metro or a taxi to the hotel. And then 4 people appeared from what seemed like nowhere. 2 Portuguese officers in uniform. 2 plainclothes. They moved with that practiced efficiency that law enforcement has. Not running, not shouting, just suddenly there, and then suddenly between him and any possible exit. One of them said his name, his full name, and then said something in Portuguese that I didn't understand, and then in English. "You are being detained in cooperation with Canadian federal authorities. Please come with us." My son-in-law turned and looked at me. I have thought about that look many times since then. I have tried to read it, tried to understand what was in it. There was shock. There was something that might have been calculation, one last check to see if there was any way out. And then, beneath all of that, something else, something smaller. I'd like to say it was shame. Maybe it was. Maybe it was just fear. I'm not sure it matters now. They took him away, and I stood there in the Lisbon airport, in Helen's blazer, with my carry-on bag and my water bottle in an evidence bag somewhere in Toronto, and the morning light coming through the terminal windows. And I just stood there for a minute. A Portuguese officer, a young woman, very professional, came to me and asked if I needed anything. Medical attention, water, a place to sit. I said I was fine. Then I started crying, which I suppose is a strange way to demonstrate that you're fine. She brought me water anyway, a sealed bottle from a vending machine. I drank the whole thing. An RCMP liaison officer, a woman who had been on the flight, seated in the back, and I had not once identified her, found me about 10 minutes later. She sat with me and explained what would happen next. My son-in-law would be held in Portugal and transferred back to Canada for formal charges. The charges would include attempted murder, possibly others, depending on what the financial crimes investigation turned up. She asked how I was doing. I said, "My daughter." She said, "Someone is with her now. She's been told." I nodded. I thought about calling her right then. I had my phone, I could have, but I didn't know what to say to her. She had been married to this man for 12 years. She had 2 children with him, and her father had spent the last 7 hours sitting next to him pretending to drink poisoned wine over the Atlantic. There are no words that work for that. Not right away. I flew back to Toronto the next day, alone. It was the longest flight of my life, and I've taken many long flights. My daughter was at the arrivals gate when I came through. She looked like she hadn't slept. She probably hadn't. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me, this daughter of mine who is 41 years old, and usually so composed, and she held on. We stood there for a long time in the middle of Pearson Airport, with people moving around us. I held her the way I used to when she was small. When she'd have a bad dream and come to our room, and Helen would make room in the middle, and we'd lie there, the 3 of us. I held her like that. Eventually she said into my shoulder, "Dad." I had no idea. I said, "I know, sweetheart. I know." And I meant it. I believed her completely. I still do. My daughter is many things. She is her mother's child in almost every way, stubborn and bright and sometimes infuriatingly logical. But she is not a liar. She did not know. The months after that were complicated in every way you would imagine. Lawyers. Statements. My son-in-law's name in the news in that way that happens now. A brief headline, a few days of local interest, then mostly quiet. My grandchildren went to stay with my daughter's parents-in-law, his parents, who were as blindsided as any of us, while things were sorted out. My daughter filed for divorce before the month was out. She didn't ask my opinion on that. She didn't need to. I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my brother. We'd grown apart. One of those gradual drifts that happens when lives go in different directions, and I told him what had happened. Not all of it at first, just the broad shape. He drove up from Kingston the next weekend. We sat on my porch in Oakville in November, bundled up like idiots, drinking coffee, and I told him the rest of it. He didn't say much. He's not a talker, my brother. But before he left, he said, "Helen would have found a way to laugh at this." He was right. She would have. She would have found some absurd angle on it. The Leafs fan husband, the poisoned water bottle with the maple leaf on it, the part where I sat next to him for 7 hours arguing about hockey and called it poetic justice. She would have made me laugh about it. That's what she was best at. I sold the house in Oakville in the spring. Not because I had to. Financially, I was fine. The pension held. The estate was never touched. But because I'd lived in that house with Helen and I needed to stop floating in the space she'd left. I bought a smaller place in Hamilton, close to the waterfront. I have a good view of the bay. In the mornings, I drink my coffee on the back porch and watch the light change on the water. My grandchildren come every other Sunday now. We make pancakes, real maple syrup, always. They still groan. They still eat it. I never made it to Lisbon. I keep thinking I might someday, on my own terms, with people I choose. Maybe with my daughter when she's ready. She talks about travel now sometimes. Carefully, the way you test ice before you trust it, and I take that as a good sign. I am 67 years old, and I have learned things this year that I would have preferred not to know. I have learned that someone can sit across from you at Christmas dinner for a decade and be calculating. I have learned that grief makes you vulnerable in ways you don't notice until someone decides to use that vulnerability against you. I have learned that a young CBSA officer with a kind face can change the shape of the rest of your life with 12 words in a jet bridge. And I have learned, or remembered, maybe, that love is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a water bottle with a maple leaf on it. Sometimes it is a daughter holding on in an airport. Sometimes it is a brother driving up from Kingston on a cold November weekend because you needed someone to sit on the porch with. Helen was right about most things. She was especially right about this. The people who genuinely love you don't need anything from you except your company. Anyone who needs more than that, be careful. Pay attention. That's all I have to say about it. That's enough.